Hi, I'm Julian. I'm a lecturer in plant ecology and biogeography.
And I'm Connie. I'm an ecologist and digital creator.
We are interested in all sorts of ecological and evolutionary questions.
And that's why we founded EcolClips.
Herbaria are plant collections that serve as important resources for species identification, naming, documenting, as well as mapping and conserving plant diversity. Despite their importance, herbaria are limited by funding, public awareness, and lack of trained taxonomists. To better understand past and future values of herbaria, we spoke to Professor Darren Crayn. Darren is head of the Australian Tropical Herbarium in Cairns, Queensland since 2008 and has a lifelong passion for botany and discovering, naming and classifying new plant species. He's particularly interested in the diversity and origin of tropical plants and how they related and evolved.
Darren, can you tell us about the task of herbaria and why we should care about them?
Yeah, absolutely. So we're standing here in the Australian Tropical Herbarium, and the task of an herbarium like ours is to document plant biodiversity. And we do that by collecting specimens from the wild and preserving them, collecting information, what we call metadata, on their field characteristics, on the locality where we've collected them, and some details of their ecology. And then we store those plants away in a collection like this one for perpetuity. And scientists can use these collections to get an understanding of diversity of morphology, of features of particular plant species, and use them for research on taxonomy, which is the science of describing and documenting plant biodiversity.
There are more than 350,000 plant species on our planet. How do you know if a species is new to science? And how do you describe a new species?
Sometimes it can be really tricky, and it can be quite a long process to decide comprehensively that something is new to science. And most of that discovery actually takes place in an herbarium like this rather than in the field. So sometimes when we're working in the field, we'll recognise a plant that we haven't seen before or looks a bit different to what we know related species look like, and that'll give us a clue that this may be a species that doesn't yet have a name. But to be certain, we'll need to look at other examples of related species, compare both the morphological features and often now the genetic characteristics of our possible new species and its relatives before we have enough evidence to conclusively say that what we've collected is something new. And most of that comparison of the morphological features, the visible features of plants, takes place in an herbarium like this, where we have lots of examples collected from across the ranges, across the broad geographical range of all kinds of plant species. So it gives us a wonderful reference collection of material that we can use to compare new collections from the wild to be able to determine whether or not they are new. And so the process of description then is to, once we've decided that we have a new species on our hands, is then to ideally collect more material of it so we can get an understanding of how much variation exists in that species in the wild. And then we will describe that variation in a scientific paper and give the species a name. And if it's accepted by a journal, then the new species enters the scientific lexicon.
We are facing a taxonomist crisis. This is mostly because of limited funding and training facilities, as well as lack of public awareness. Can you tell us why it is important to train more taxonomists, and what are the biggest challenges in overcoming this crisis?
We need taxonomy, and to do taxonomy, we need taxonomists. So, because taxonomy is like a foundational science, if we don't have a catalogue of life on Earth, then all of the downstream biological sciences don't have a foundation. If we don't know what things are called and what they look like, how can we do any other kind of biological science? How can we understand the value of the natural world to our health and to our economy? If we don't have the dictionary, if you like, of species, then we have no reference point for comparison. So taxonomy is critically important. As I say, it's one of those foundational sciences. And we need highly trained people to do that. And at least in Australia, we've had a good pipeline of highly trained taxonomists coming through to work in herbaria like this for a long period of time. But that is really thinning out now. There was a large investment by the government in the 1960s and the 1970s in science broadly, and of course taxonomic science was a beneficiary of some of that investment. But that investment has really declined in the last 20 or 30 years. And all of those scientists who were trained in the 60s and 70s as a consequence of that investment are now retiring. And we're really struggling to find new taxonomists or younger taxonomists who are trained and experienced to fill those retired positions. Part of the problem is universities are not training very many taxonomists anymore. It used to be a generation ago that most large universities had a degree program in taxonomy. Often different degree programs in animal taxonomy and plant taxonomy. But it's quite rare to find a taxonomy major in any university these days. And the problem is largely because there is not a huge amount of interest from students in doing taxonomic sciences. There is still some interest, but it's very patchy across a nation like Australia. So in any one city, you might only get a small number of high school leavers who want to be taxonomists. And because universities are driven by financial constraints, if they've only got a few students wanting to do a particular degree program, it's not in their interest to run it. So there may be hundreds of students across the country, but in any one place, there's not enough to justify a taxonomic degree at a major university. So this is the problem. We've got a scattered interest group and a scattered workforce that's not big enough in any one place to justify those training resources. So we've got to find a model for training the next generation of taxonomists that avoids that problem or gets around that problem of the dispersed interest group. And maybe that model is something like, a distributed course. We now have amazing resources online for online teaching and learning. And it should be possible to find a way for the universities to work together to be able to teach a distributed program across multiple universities in multiple cities and states, so that no one university takes on the full burden of teaching a taxonomy course.
How did the work or the responsibilities of Herbaria changed over time during your career? And what are the challenges Herbaria face in the future?
Well, the methods we've used have changed drastically in some ways since I started as a taxonomist back in the last century, in the 1990s. I remember when I started doing my research degree, my PhD, molecular genetics was still relatively new. Now molecular genetics is an automatic part of the taxonomic toolkit, Most taxonomic studies will incorporate genetic data of some kind in an assessment of species distinctiveness. But when I started, it was very much the shiny new thing. It was still very expensive, and there wasn't a lot of expertise around to draw on. But it's almost routine nowadays. That's been a big change, and that's been a big change for the better. Because so many times when you're working simply with morphological material, it's unclear whether the morphological variation you see has any meaning biologically, and there's a limit to the number of features you can observe morphologically. Whereas if you can access the genome, you've got vast numbers of or vast amounts of biological variation that you can compare. So that's been a huge change. The other big change, that's in terms of taxonomic scientific practice. In terms of herbarium specimen management practices, perhaps the biggest change has been digitisation. So most herbaria nowadays, at very least, have all of the metadata associated with the individual specimens in an electronic database, and in most cases then available to the public through a public data portal of some kind. And in Australia, that public data portal is called the Atlas of Living Australia. So all of Australia's major herbaria deliver all of their specimen record data through the Atlas of Living Australia, which is an incredible resource. And even further now, most herbaria have embarked upon a specimen digitisation program where we're taking high-resolution digital images of the individual specimens themselves, so not just the metadata, but the actual specimens. And this is driving huge changes in how we think about how we use herbarium specimens for science, and in fact how we manage herbarium. Because historically, when a taxonomist in Europe may have wanted to study acacias, they would have to borrow specimens. They have specimens from Australian herbaria physically sent to Europe, housed in their, or borrowed by them, housed in their collections for a period of time while they're being studied, and then physically sent back when they're finished with. Nowadays, 9 times out of 10, we will just send high-resolution digital images. And digital images won't answer all the questions you have about a specimen, but they'll answer an awful lot. I mean, you can't section and look at the anatomy of a digital image, and you can't access the biomolecules in a digital image, DNA and proteins and so on. But you can answer a lot of questions about morphological difference by looking at a high-resolution digital image. So we don't send specimens physically in the post nowadays to the extent that we used to. And that's been a big change. But also, having available vast numbers of specimen images from right across species ranges has opened up a whole lot of new branches of comparative sciences and comparative ecological sciences as well, where ecologists who may be interested in leaf size variation and how that associates with environmental variables such as temperature, humidity, and all of the rest of it, have access to almost limitless numbers of digital images of herbarium specimens to compare those leaf morphological traits. And that's really driving a massive change in a whole range of different kinds of sciences.
What is your advice then for early career researchers interested in botany and species identification?
2 bits of advice I would give. One is never forget to go to the field. It's very easy to spend all of your life in a collection or inside a research building, and there's enormous numbers of things to do in a collection like this. But when we view an herbarium specimen, we're looking at a two-dimensional representation of just a part of a plant. To really understand what that plant is doing ecologically, you need to get out and have a look at how it behaves in the natural environment. So you learn a whole lot about biology in the field that you can't learn any other way. So always remember to go to the field. The second bit of advice I would give is to be very broad-minded in your training about technology. Because I remember thinking when I was an undergraduate that this particular technological development is probably not going to be relevant to me because I work on this kind of science. But increasingly, the rate at which new methodologies and technologies are developing in all sciences, and the degree of integration and collaboration across scientific boundaries is increasing, that if a particular new technology is not relevant to herbaria today, it probably will be tomorrow. Artificial intelligence and those sorts of technologies, digital technologies, are a case in point. 5 years ago, most people would have thought, well, I can't see any relevance of AI for herbaria. But now we have digital images. We can use AI to scan or compute things to do with that vast store of digital images, search for features, for example, we may be interested in, and so reduce vast amounts of workload for human beings. So be agnostic about technology and be open-minded about the sorts of technologies that you engage with in your undergraduate and postgraduate training, because you never know. It may be the next big thing in 5 years.
Do you have a favorite plant species or a favorite group or family of plant species?
I like a lot of plants, but I guess the ones that are of most interest to me at the moment are, one group of plants that I've been working on for some years now, and that's a genus called Elaeocarpus, which is a genus of rainforest trees in the family Elaeocarpaceae. And I've described a number of new species in that family, and I've had a number of postgraduate students working on the systematics and evolution of that particular group. So I would have to say they're my favourite.
Great, thank you very much.